The massive transport ship cut through space like a knife, its engines humming with barely contained power. Inside the cargo bay, 12 military academy cadets stood in a loose formation, each representing the best their species had to offer. The air recyclers worked overtime, creating a constant low buzz that did nothing to ease the tension in the room. Jake Morrison rolled his shoulders and tried to shake off the nerves. At 22, he was the only human among creatures that seemed pulled straight from a science fiction movie. His thermal suit felt bulky and awkward compared to the sleek equipment worn by his competitors. The fabric was thick and practical, designed by humans for humans, but it looked ancient next to the shimmering, form-fitting gear the other species wore. The Zephyrian called Krill stood nearly 8 feet tall, his crystalline body catching the ship's interior lights and throwing rainbow patterns across the metal walls. His people came from an ice world where temperatures never rose above freezing, and his natural biology seemed perfectly suited for cold weather survival. Jake had read about Zephyrians in his academy textbooks. They could regulate their body temperature through their crystal formations and actually grew stronger in cold environments. Near the viewport, the Klavek twins Zix and Nox communicated through rapid clicking sounds that hurt Jake's ears. These insect-like beings had evolved on a planet with extreme seasonal changes. When winter came to their world, entire populations would enter hibernation for months at a time. Their suits contained advanced heating elements that could keep them active even when their natural instincts told them to sleep. The 3 Hydronian cadets formed their own small group. Flux, Wave, and Deep came from ocean worlds where water never froze. Their specialized suits were marvels of engineering, containing heating systems so advanced that they could supposedly keep the wearer comfortable in the vacuum of space. Jake had watched them demonstrate their equipment during training exercises, and the technology seemed like magic to him. Looking around at his competitors, Jake felt like he was bringing a stick to a laser fight. His gear was standard issue for human survival situations. Thermal underwear, insulated jacket, waterproof boots, and a basic emergency beacon. No fancy crystal biology, no hibernation abilities, no space-age heating technology. Just cloth, synthetic insulation, and hope. Commander Vex's voice crackled through the ship's communication system. The alien officer had served in the galactic military for over 3 decades and had seen cadets from every known species attempt this trial. His reputation for being completely impartial was legendary, as was a complete lack of sympathy for failure. The ship's engines changed pitch, signaling their approach to Kepler 438c. Through the small portholes, Jake caught his first glimpse of their destination. The moon looked like a frozen marble, white and gray with swirling cloud formations that spoke of constant storms. Weather readings had shown surface temperatures averaging negative 40 degrees Celsius, with wind speeds that could knock a person off their feet. As the transport ship entered the moon's atmosphere, Jake felt the familiar sensation of atmospheric entry. The hull vibrated and groaned under stress, and several of the alien cadets activated various pieces of their survival equipment. Krill's crystals began to glow with a soft blue light. The Klavek twin suits hummed to life with an almost musical tone. The Hydronians ran diagnostics on their heating systems, their equipment displaying readouts in languages Jake couldn't read. Jake checked his own gear one more time. His thermal suit showed normal readings, and his emergency beacon had a full charge. Everything worked exactly as it was supposed to, but compared to the technological marvels surrounding him, he felt distinctly under-equipped. The cargo bay doors began their opening sequence with a hydraulic hiss that seemed to go on forever. Cold air rushed into the ship immediately, and Jake's breath became visible in small puffs. The temperature dropped rapidly, and he could feel the cold trying to seep through his insulation. Outside, a landscape of ice and snow stretched to the horizon under a gray sky filled with swirling clouds. Commander Vex's final instructions echoed through the bay as each cadet prepared to step onto the frozen surface. 72 hours to survive using only what they carried. No outside assistance, no rescue unless someone activated their emergency beacon, which would mean immediate disqualification from the trial. Jake took a deep breath of the rapidly cooling air and stepped toward the exit. Around him, his competitors seemed confident and ready. Their advanced technology hummed and glowed, creating an atmosphere of technological superiority that made Jake's simple gear seem almost primitive. But as he looked out at the harsh landscape waiting for them, something his grandfather had always told him came to mind. Old Pete Morrison had been an Alaska wilderness guide who had survived situations that would have killed most people. He always said that the best survival tool wasn't fancy equipment or special abilities. It was a willingness to keep thinking and keep working when everything else failed. Jake adjusted his thermal suit one final time and prepared to find out if his grandfather had been right. The second day on Kepler, 438 sea dawned gray and merciless. Jake Morrison woke up inside his makeshift windbreak, his thermal suit's readings showing that the temperature had dropped even further during the night. His breath came out in thick white clouds, and frost had formed on the inside of his face mask. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was still thinking clearly. The same couldn't be said for his competitors. Krill stood about 50 yards away, perfectly still like a frozen statue. At first glance, Jake thought the Zephyrian was simply conserving energy, but as he got closer, he could see the problem. Thin lines ran across Krill's crystalline body, like cracks in ice. The stress fractures started small near his joints, but were spreading slowly across his torso. The beautiful rainbow patterns that had danced across his surface today, before were gone, replaced by a dull, lifeless gray. Jake had read about this in his xenobiology classes. Zephyrians were built for cold, but they needed a specific type of cold, the ice worlds where they evolved at stable, predictable temperatures. This moon's wild temperature swings and strange atmospheric composition were causing thermal shock to Krill's crystal matrix. His body's natural regulation system, so perfectly adapted to his homeworld, was failing catastrophically in this alien environment. The Klavek twins were in even worse shape. Zix and Nox had curled up together in a small depression they'd scraped in the snow. Their insect-like bodies were locked in hibernation poses, legs tucked under their thoraxes, mandibles clamped shut. Jake knelt beside them and could barely detect breathing. Their survival suits still hummed with power, but the heating elements weren't enough to keep them active. Their biology had triggered an emergency hibernation response, and now they were basically unconscious until spring came to this frozen moon. The situation with the Hydronians was the most dramatic. Jake heard Flux's heating unit fail before he saw it. The high-pitched whine of overloaded electronics cut through the wind, followed by a shower of sparks and the acrid smell of burned circuits. Flux dropped face first into the snow, his suit's display screens going dark one by one. Wave and Deep reacted instantly, grabbing their teammate under his arms and dragging him toward a cluster of rocks that offered minimal protection from the wind. But Jake could see their own suits flickering with warning lights. The advanced Hydronian technology that had seemed so impressive on a transport ship was breaking down under conditions it was never designed to handle. Jake's own gear was struggling. His thermal suit's heater worked in short bursts to conserve battery power, and he could feel the cold seeping through the insulation at his wrists and ankles. The emergency beacon on his belt stayed green, but he knew that once he activated it, the trial would be over for him. But unlike the other cadets, Jake wasn't panicking. Growing up in northern Minnesota had taught him that cold weather was just another problem to solve. His father had been a construction worker who specialized in winter projects, and every weekend during Jake's childhood had been spent learning how to work with frozen ground, icy conditions, and equipment that didn't want to function below zero. Then there were the summers at his grandfather's place in Alaska. Old Pete Morrison had been a wilderness guide who took hunting parties into places where the nearest road was 100 miles away. Pete had taught Jake that survival wasn't about having the best gear. It was about understanding how the world around you worked and adapting to it. While the alien cadets focused on their failing technology, Jake began studying the environment itself. He walked the perimeter of their landing area, noting how the wind moved across the landscape. Some areas were constantly blasted by freezing air, while others sat in relative calm. The snow varied in texture and depth, telling stories about previous storms and temperature changes. Jake collected rocks of different types, hefting them in his hands and noting which ones felt dense and which seemed porous. Dense rocks would hold heat longer once warmed. Porous rocks might insulate better, but wouldn't store thermal energy. He examined ice formations, understanding that clear ice meant different conditions than cloudy ice, and that the shape of frozen water could tell him about wind patterns and temperature fluctuations. Most importantly, Jake started thinking about fire. The alien cadets had heating technology, but Jake had something they didn't understand. He had hands that knew how to work, a brain that understood basic physics, and childhood memories of building campfires in Minnesota snowstorms. As he watched his competitors growing weaker and more desperate, Jake remembered his grandfather's most important lesson. Pete had said it during a particularly brutal camping trip, when 13-year-old Jake was complaining about their basic equipment compared to the high-tech gear other campers carried. Work with what you've got, not what you wish you had. The old man had said, building a fire with nothing but matches and dry kindling he prepared earlier. Fancy gear fails when you need it most, but your hands and your brain, those work until the day you die. Jake's hands were cold, but they still worked, and his brain was already forming a plan. Jake's fingers had lost most of their feeling an hour ago, but he kept working anyway. The cold bit through his gloves like they were made of paper, turning his hands into clumsy blocks of meat that barely responded to his commands. But his grandfather had always said that cold hands could still work as long as the person attached to them refused to quit. He started with the rocks he'd been collecting. Each stone had to be tested and placed carefully. Jake stacked them in a rough circle, creating a barrier that would block the worst of the wind. His movements were slow and deliberate, not because he wanted to take his time, but because rushing would only lead to mistakes. A poorly built windbreak would collapse when the next storm hit, and starting over would cost him precious energy he couldn't afford to waste. Once the basic windbreak was complete, Jake moved on to the real challenge. He pulled apart his emergency kit, looking for anything that could create sparks. The kit contained standard survival items designed for emergencies, not extended wilderness living. But Jake had learned to see potential in unlikely places. The emergency beacon had a metal casing that could be scraped. Jake carefully pried off a section of steel, creating a rough edge that would work like a primitive fire steel. He tested it against different rocks from his collection, looking for one that would produce good sparks. Most of the stones were too soft or smooth, but eventually he found a piece of what looked like flint that threw bright orange sparks when struck properly. The alien cadets who were still conscious watched him with growing confusion. They had never seen anyone try to create fire without modern technology. To them, Jake's actions looked like some kind of primitive ritual that couldn't possibly work. They had heating elements and power cells and sophisticated temperature control systems. The idea that someone could create warmth by scraping metal against rocks seemed impossible. Jake ignored their stares and focused on his work. Creating sparks was only the first step. He needed something that would catch fire and burn long enough to ignite larger fuel. During his exploration of the area, he had found small pieces of organic material blown in from somewhere else. Tiny fragments of what might have been plant matter, dried and preserved by the cold. It wasn't much, but Jake had started fires with less. He arranged the tinder carefully in a small nest, then began striking his improvised fire steel against the flint. The first dozen attempts produced nothing but cold sparks that died instantly. His hands were shaking from the cold, making it hard to control the angle and pressure. But Jake kept trying, adjusting his technique with each strike. Finally, a spark landed in the tinder and began to glow. Jake dropped to his knees and began blowing gently on the tiny ember, feeding it just enough oxygen to grow without overwhelming it. The smell of burning organic matter filled his nostrils, and after what felt like an eternity, a small flame flickered to life. Building the fire into something useful took another hour of careful work. Jake fed it gradually, starting with the smallest pieces of combustible material he could find and slowly working up to larger fuel. He built a small reflector wall, using metal scraps from the drop pods, angling the surface to direct heat back toward where he planned to build his shelter. The shelter itself required every bit of engineering knowledge Jake had picked up during his academy training. He created multiple air chambers using debris and his understanding of how heat moved through enclosed spaces. Warm air would rise into the upper chambers while cold air stayed near the ground. He built ventilation channels to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning, remembering stories his grandfather had told about people who died in their sleep because they sealed their shelters too tightly. As Jake worked, the condition of the alien cadets continued to deteriorate. Krill's stress fractures had spread across most of his crystalline torso, creating a web of cracks that seemed to grow larger every hour. The Zephyrian stood motionless, his body's natural repair systems overwhelmed by the constant thermal stress. The Klavek twins hadn't moved in hours. Jake checked on them periodically, noting that their breathing had slowed to almost nothing. Their hibernation response was keeping them alive, but barely. If the temperature dropped much further, even their reduced metabolic state wouldn't be enough to sustain them. Flux was in the worst shape of all. His heating unit's failure had left him completely dependent on his body's natural temperature regulation, but Hydronians had evolved in warm ocean environments. His core temperature was dropping toward levels that would cause permanent damage to his internal organs. Wave and Deep huddled around their teammate, sharing what little heat their own failing systems could provide, but Jake could see that all three of them were losing the battle against the cold. Looking at his dying competitors, Jake faced a decision that went against every competitive instinct he possessed. This was supposed to be a trial where only one cadet survived. Helping the others could be seen as cheating or worse. It could put his own survival at risk by forcing him to share his limited resources. But as Jake looked at Krill's cracking body and the Klavek twins' motionless forms, he heard his grandfather's voice in his memory. Pete Morrison had always said that a man's character wasn't measured by what he did when it was easy, but by what he did when it cost him something. Jake made his choice. He grabbed Krill first, the Zephyrian's crystalline body surprisingly light despite its size. "Come on," he muttered through chattering teeth as he dragged the semi-conscious alien toward a shelter. "Nobody dies on my watch." Jake's rough shelter transformed from a desperate survival attempt into something that resembled actual engineering. The warmth from his fire pit spread to the carefully designed air chambers, creating pockets of heated air that circulated throughout the structure. It wasn't pretty to look at, built from salvaged metal, stacked rocks, and debris from their drop pods, but it worked in ways that the alien sophisticated technology had failed to achieve. Krill was the first to show improvement. The Zephyrian stress fractures, which had been spreading like spider webs across his crystalline body, suddenly stopped growing. The steady warmth allowed his natural repair systems to begin functioning again. Jake watched in fascination as tiny crystal formations started filling in the smaller cracks. Krill's surface, which had been dull gray for hours, began to show hints of an original rainbow shimmer. The big alien's recovery was slow, but steady. His crystalline biology, so perfectly adapted for his homeworld's stable cold, seemed to respond well to the consistent heat Jake's fire provided. Unlike the wild temperature fluctuations outside the shelter, the interior maintained a relatively steady warmth that allowed Krill's body to stabilize and begin healing itself. Zix and Nox took longer to respond, but eventually Jake noticed small movements from the hibernating Klavek twins. First, their mandibles began to move slightly, making tiny clicking sounds. Then their legs started to unfold from beneath their bodies. The warming air triggered their biology to slowly emerge from emergency hibernation mode. It was like watching flowers bloom in extremely slow motion. Jake had to be careful with the twins during their recovery. Coming out of hibernation too quickly could shock their systems, so he gradually increased the temperature around them by moving them closer to the fire pit in stages. Their insect-like biology was fascinating to observe. As warmth returned to their systems, their natural colors became more vibrant, and their movements became more coordinated. The Hydronians showed the most dramatic improvement. Flux, who had been barely conscious when Jake dragged him into the shelter, began responding within an hour of exposure to the fire's heat. His skin, which had taken on a pale, bluish tint from hypothermia, gradually returned to its normal aqua color. Wave and Deep, who had been using their own failing body heat to keep their teammate alive, finally relaxed as their friend's condition stabilized. "How?" Krill whispered when he was finally able to speak clearly. His voice had a musical quality, like wind chimes made of crystal. "Your technology is so primitive compared to ours. We have heating systems powered by fusion cells, temperature regulators that can function in the vacuum of space. You built this with rocks and metal scraps." Jake fed another piece of fuel to his fire, watching the flames dance and throw moving shadows on the shelter walls. The fuel came from wooden components he'd salvaged from the drop pod packaging, carefully rationed to last through the remaining time. Sometimes primitive is exactly what works, he replied, adjusting the airflow to optimize the burn rate. Your fusion cells and regulators are amazing, but they were designed for specific conditions. This fire doesn't care what planet we're on or what the atmosphere composition is. Heat is heat. As the final night of the trial approached, Jake continued improving his shelter system. He couldn't help himself. Every hour brought new ideas for better heat distribution or improved insulation. He built a second fire pit on the opposite side of the shelter, creating redundant heating in case one fire went out. Using rocks of different sizes, he constructed channels that directed warm air to the areas where the aliens were recovering. His most ambitious project was a crude chimney system. Jake had noticed that smoke management was becoming a problem as more aliens crowded into the shelter. Using salvaged metal sheets and his understanding of airflow, he created vents that pulled smoke up and out while keeping the warm air circulating inside. It wasn't perfect and it required constant adjustment, but it worked. The aliens watched his every move with growing amazement. These beings represented some of the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy, yet none of them had ever seen someone solve problems through pure manual labor and basic physics principles. Their civilizations had advanced beyond the need for such primitive methods thousands of years ago. Wave, the Hydronian who had initially seemed the most skeptical of human abilities, stared at Jake with something approaching awe. "We never learned to create without machines," he admitted, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment. "On our worlds, if we need heat, we activate a heating unit. If we need shelter, we deploy prefabricated structures. I've never seen anyone build something from nothing before." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead. Despite the cold air outside the shelter, the physical work of constantly improving and maintaining their refuge was exhausting, but also kept his blood flowing and his core temperature stable. "Lucky for you," he replied with a tired smile. "Humans had to learn that first. We spent thousands of years figuring out fire, shelter, and tool-making before we ever got to fusion cells and space travel. Sometimes the old ways are the ways that save your life." Deep, who had been quiet since recovering from his hypothermia, spoke up for the first time in hours. "You could have just saved yourself. This trial was supposed to test individual survival. Why risk your own safety to help us?" Jake looked around at the 11 alien cadets who now filled his improvised shelter, representatives of the galaxy's most advanced species, all alive because a human had refused to let them die. "Because that's what humans do," he said simply. "We survive together, or we don't survive at all." Outside the shelter, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside, 12 different species shared warmth around fires built by human hands. The rescue ship's engines roared as it descended through Kepler, for 38C's turbulent atmosphere. Commander Vex stood at the bridge viewport, expecting to find maybe 3 or 4 survivors huddled around failing equipment. The survival trial had been conducted for over 2 decades, and the best result they'd ever seen was 7 cadets making it through the full 72 hours. What he found instead defied everything he thought he knew about survival in extreme conditions. Jake's improvised shelter complex sprawled across nearly 50 square meters of the landing zone. Multiple fire pits sent columns of smoke into the gray sky, connected by an intricate network of stone channels and metal reflectors that distributed heat throughout the entire structure. The main shelter had grown into something that resembled actual architecture, with separate chambers for sleeping, equipment storage, and even what appeared to be a primitive but functional waste management system. All 12 cadets emerged from the shelter as the rescue ship touched down, not just alive, but walking under their own power. Krill's crystalline body showed only faint traces of the stress fractures that had nearly killed him. The Klavek twins moved with their normal, quick, coordinated movements. The Hydronians looked healthy and alert, their skin showing the proper aqua coloration of their species. Commander Vex stepped off the ship and stood speechless for nearly a full minute. In all his years of military service, he had never seen anything quite like this. The shelter wasn't just functional, it was sophisticated. Jake had somehow created a heating and ventilation system that worked better than some military-grade emergency shelters he'd seen. "Impossible," he muttered, walking around the perimeter of Jake's construction. "No survival trial has ever had a 100% survival rate. Most species lose at least 40% of their cadets during the first night. Jake was busy dismantling his fire pits and scattering the ashes, following basic wilderness ethics even on an alien moon. The key was redundancy, sir, he explained to the stunned commander. Multiple heat sources, backup ventilation, and making sure everyone understood how to maintain the system if something went wrong with one component. The other cadets gathered around as Jake explained his methods. They listened with the intensity of students trying to understand a completely foreign concept. Wave asked how Jake had calculated the optimal angles for his heat reflectors. Deep wanted to know how he determined the correct airflow rates for the ventilation system. Krill was fascinated by Jake's fuel rationing strategy that had kept the fires burning for the entire trial period. News of the unprecedented survival rate spread through the Galactic Military Academy within hours of the rescue ship's return. What had started as a routine survival trial had become something much more significant. Academy instructors who had been teaching survival techniques for decades suddenly found themselves questioning their fundamental assumptions about what was possible in extreme environments. The story grew in the telling, as stories often do. Jake Morrison became known as a human who had built civilization from nothing but rocks and metal scraps. But the real impact went far deeper than one cadet's remarkable achievement. For the first time, the galaxy's military leadership began to seriously examine what made humans different from other spacefaring species. Commander Vex spent weeks writing his analysis report. The implications of what he'd witnessed went beyond military training. He researched human evolutionary history, studying their planet's climate records and geological surveys. What he discovered changed his entire understanding of why humans seemed to approach problems differently than other species. Humans evolved on what we classify as a Category 5 death world, he wrote in his final report to the Academy Council. Earth experiences extreme seasonal variations, unpredictable weather patterns, natural disasters, and environmental conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by most galactic species. Survival on such a world required constant adaptation, tool creation, and problem-solving under life-threatening conditions. The report continued for dozens of pages, but the core conclusion was simple. While other species had developed advanced technology to overcome environmental challenges, humans had developed something potentially more valuable. They possessed an almost instinctive ability to create solutions using whatever materials were available, combined with an apparently unlimited capacity for manual labor and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Jake graduated top of his class 6 months later, but his academic achievements seemed almost secondary to what had happened on that frozen moon. His real accomplishment was opening the galaxy's eyes to what humans casually call common sense, the ability to survive and thrive using nothing but their hands, their minds, and their determination to keep working when everything seemed hopeless. The survival trial, which had been designed to test individual endurance and self-preservation instincts, had instead revealed humanity's greatest strength. When faced with impossible odds, humans didn't just try to endure until rescue arrived. They looked at their environment, figured out how to improve it, and then worked tirelessly to build something better than what they'd started with. More importantly, they did it while making sure everyone else survived too. Jake could have built a shelter just large enough for himself and let the alien cadets face their own fates. Instead, he had expanded his construction to accommodate everyone, sharing his resources and knowledge freely even though it meant more work and greater risk for himself. The galaxy had always known that humans were tough and adaptable. But Jake's actions on Kepler, for 38 he demonstrated something even more significant. Humans were builders. When everything went wrong and technology failed and conditions became impossible, they would find a way to create something that worked, and they would make sure their friends survived alongside them. That lesson would prove invaluable in the years to come, as the galaxy faced challenges that no amount of advanced technology could solve. Sometimes, the most sophisticated solution was a human with cold hands and an absolute refusal to give up,